There's a moment in every investigation where the ground starts to shift, where the story you thought you understood suddenly feels wrong. And in the case of Little Gus, that moment didn't take weeks. It didn't take months. It happened almost immediately. The very moment when evidence, timeline, and logic stopped matching the idea that a 4-year-old simply wandered off into the Australian outback. Because when you look closely, when you listen to the details, when you pay attention to what didn't happen, you start to feel it. That tightening in your stomach. That sense that something here doesn't add up. This case didn't just go quiet. It went silent. Too silent. And today, we're uncovering the exact point where that silence stopped being normal and started becoming a warning sign. The point where the search teams, the community, and even seasoned investigators looked at each other and realised something isn't right here. If you care about cases like this, and you want to help keep Gus's name alive, make sure you hit that subscribe button, tap like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement genuinely pushes this story out to more people, and the more eyes on this case, the better. Now, let's break down the moment everything changed. The moment when this went from a simple disappearance to a mystery that still makes people uneasy. The first moment this case stopped making sense happened during the earliest stages of the search, and most people don't realise how unusual it really was. Search teams were brought in quickly. Dogs, drones, volunteers, local police. People walked shoulder to shoulder through rugged ground, checking every track, every bush, every scrape of dirt where a small child might have passed. And yet, nothing. Not a footprint, not a sock, not a piece of clothing snagged on a branch, not even disturbed soil that would normally show where a child had walked, slipped, sat, or cried. This wasn't a "we didn't find enough" situation. This was a "we didn't find anything" situation. Search experts, people who've done this for years, quietly said the same thing. A child that young always leaves some sign. Always. That's the moment people started to feel that tug of confusion. The sense that the environment itself wasn't matching the story being told. Because think about it clearly. A 4-year-old doesn't move silently. A 4-year-old doesn't travel far. A 4-year-old doesn't avoid leaving evidence by accident. And the area being searched wasn't endless wilderness. It was a specific controlled location, one that should have produced clues immediately, but it didn't. And that was the first red flag. A simple, subtle, quiet red flag, but the kind that experienced search coordinators notice instantly. Before we go deeper, if you want YouTube to push this story out to more people and help keep attention on Gus's case, make sure you like this video and drop a comment, even if it's just a single word. It genuinely helps. The next moment when this case stopped making sense came from something that should have been simple: the timeline. In missing child investigations, the timeline is everything. Who saw the child last? What time? Where were the adults? How long before they realised the child was gone? It sounds basic, but in this case, that timeline has shifted, paused, stretched, and bent in ways that don't sit comfortably with a lot of people following the story. Several details from the early hours appeared unclear or inconsistent. How long was Gus actually unsupervised? Different interviews and reports seem to give slightly different impressions of the gap. Exactly where was everyone located at the moment he went missing? Some accounts leave space, too much space, between the adults and the child. Why was there a delay during the first moments of searching? In most cases, adults shout, run, panic within seconds. But here, some parts of that early response feel slowed down. These aren't accusations, they're observations. The same ones people across the community have been quietly questioning. And here's the thing, a timeline doesn't have to be perfect. People panic, memories blur, emotions take over. But when a timeline continues to feel soft, even days or weeks after an incident, it raises eyebrows. Even trained investigators look for patterns within those inconsistencies, because anywhere the timeline wobbles, that's often where the truth is hiding. If you're watching right now, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe. It helps more people hear about Gus. and it pushes the video out to a bigger audience so the conversation doesn't fade. Another moment when this case stopped making sense happened during the massive ground search. Hundreds of trained searchers, police, volunteers, military personnel, combed the property. They covered kilometres of open land using grid patterns, drones, Polaris vehicles, thermal imaging, dogs, and aerial surveillance. And here's where things get confusing. Despite all of that effort, not a single trace was found. No footprints, no clothing, no disturbed soil, nothing. For a child who was described as a good walker, it's surprising that there wasn't even a directional indicator, not one sign pointing to where he could have gone. Even search experts have quietly noted that the environment around the homestead should have produced some kind of physical clue if the child had simply wandered off. Normally, in wide open rural terrain, you would expect at least one partial footprint, a mark on the ground, a trail interrupted, or an item dropped. But the searchers found zero physical evidence. Zero. That's not typical. And that's why this portion of the case has become one of the biggest pressure points. It's one of the reasons people began to question whether something outside the obvious explanation might be involved. And this is where the conversation around the moment things stopped making sense becomes louder. Because when the land gives you nothing, the mystery only deepens. If you're following along and you want updates as we keep breaking this case down, make sure you hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment with your thoughts so far. Another point where many people felt the case stopped making sense was when police officially shifted from a search and rescue to a recovery operation. Normally, that kind of change only happens when investigators have strong indicators that survival is no longer likely. But in this situation, the public was never informed about any specific discovery or turning point that justified that shift. There was no physical evidence, no confirmed sighting, no major breakthrough, no environmental hazard proven to be fatal. Yet, the operation changed direction. For many people watching the case closely, this decision raised a huge question. What led police to make that call? Officials said they were guided by medical experts, specifically regarding how long a small child could survive out there. But even that triggered debate, because there have been documented cases of children surviving for surprising lengths of time in harsh conditions, especially when there are water sources, shade, or homestead materials nearby. So naturally, people began to wonder, did police learn something they didn't publicly release? Was the shift based purely on the time elapsed or something else? And if time was the only factor, why was the decision made so quickly in a case with zero physical evidence? That moment, when the tone of the investigation changed, made a lot of people stop and rethink the entire timeline. It created more questions than answers, and it added emotional weight for the public who were still hoping for a different outcome. If you want more updates as we dig deeper into this case, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Another point where this case truly stopped making sense for thousands of people was when investigators revealed that after all the ground searches, all the drone sweeps, all the air support, all the tracking teams, there was still no confirmed trace of Gus except for a single footprint. Just one. No clothing caught on branches, no second footprint, no trail, no dropped object, no sign of struggle, no scent path that dogs could follow successfully. And that baffled people, because if a child walked away, even by accident, especially in loose red dirt and open terrain, there should have been something left behind. There should have been at least a small pattern, even if faint. But the absence of any trail is what made many people say, wait, how is that possible? This is where more questions began to surface. If the ground was soft enough to show one footprint, why didn't it show two? Did weather erase other tracks? Or were they simply never there? Was the footprint truly Gus's, or just a matching size? If the boy walked off, why didn't he leave a visible direction of travel? And remember, police noted there were no signs of foul play. So people were left caught in the middle. On one hand, no evidence of an abduction. On the other hand, no evidence of an extended walkaway either. This missing trail problem is one of the biggest reasons the public still questions the official explanation. Because the landscape doesn't erase everything. Not that quickly. Not that cleanly. Something about that moment made a lot of people feel like the story had hit a confusion point. A gap that no one has filled yet. If you're following this case as closely as we are, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts below. Another moment where this case stopped making sense for a lot of people was when the search patterns no longer aligned with the expected behaviour of a young child. See, when a child wanders off, search experts usually follow very specific movement models. Children of certain ages tend to walk predictable distances and follow certain patterns. They often move downhill, not uphill. They usually stop when they get tired. They tend to stay within a certain radius from the point they were last seen. And most importantly, their tracks usually lead somewhere. But here's the strange part in this case. 3 full-scale searches, with some of the best personnel and equipment in the region, didn't produce a single meaningful lead about which direction Gus went. Not a trail, not a pattern, not a final point, nothing that tells the story of movement. For many observers, that was the moment they said, "This doesn't follow the usual search logic anymore." Because trained search teams usually find something: a piece of clothing, a disturbed area of ground, a broken twig, a scent trail, a clear footprint sequence, anything that helps form a movement path. But the silence in the results is what made the situation feel unusual. It's not that the landscape erased everything. It's not that the searchers weren't skilled. It's that the outcome didn't match what typically happens in similar cases. And that disconnect between expected movement and actual findings created one of the biggest waves of public confusion so far. If you're invested in understanding this case as much as we are, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps us keep digging deeper. Another point where this case completely stopped making sense was when people started comparing the publicly known timeline with what would realistically happen in that short window of time. Let's break it down in the simplest way. Gus was last seen around 4:30 p.m. By 5:00 p.m, he was already missing and not responding. By 5:30 p.m, the search had begun. So there's roughly a 30-minute gap where everything happened, or didn't happen. And that's where the confusion comes in, because if a child wanders, even in difficult terrain, there are limits to how far they can realistically go in that short amount of time. Experts estimate roughly 400 metres, maybe 600 metres at most, 1 kilometre in unusual cases, but after multiple extensive searches, nothing was found within any of these radiuses. Now, here's the part that really puzzled people. The distance he would have needed to travel to leave the search area, without leaving a single sign, simply doesn't match what a 4-year-old could physically achieve in that time. No footprints, no disturbed ground, no object dropped, no path showing direction, and no scent trail for the dogs to follow. This discrepancy is what made many people say, the timeline doesn't fit the wandering theory anymore. Because if the movement doesn't make sense, and the distance doesn't make sense, and the lack of evidence doesn't make sense, then something else might have happened during that 30-minute window. This moment, when the timeline itself fell apart, is what pushed thousands of people to look at the case with new eyes. And as we continue to break this down piece by piece, make sure you like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts. Your engagement truly helps us reach more people who care about this case. Another moment where everything stopped making sense was when people began to notice the gaps in communication, from statements, from updates, and from people connected to the property. It wasn't just what was being said, it was what wasn't being said. Here's what viewers, locals, and even former detectives started pointing out. 1. The family's statements stopped matching early expectations. At first, the messaging was simple. Gus wandered off. Everyone was searching. He must be close by. But as the days went on, and not a single trace was found, the narrative didn't shift, even though the facts did. People expected a public acknowledgement like, something isn't adding up, but instead, silence. 2. Visitors and workers from the property rarely spoke publicly. In high-profile missing child cases, people connected to the scene often step forward, to clarify, to share details, to help piece the story together. But here, The group around the property remained extremely quiet. Too quiet. No public appeals, no independent statements, no clarifications. Just nothing. And when multiple people connected to the property avoid speaking, the public notices. Silence becomes suspicious. 3. Police updates grew smaller instead of larger. Normally, when a case hits a standstill, law enforcement expands. Presses, new leads, community warnings. Instead, police updates here seemed to shrink. Not because the case was solved, but because investigators were clearly turning inward toward people rather than land. That shift created a sense of controlled silence, as though something sensitive was happening behind the scenes. 4. Former Detective Gary Jubilin's comments filled the silence. When Jubilin said police were focusing on people around the property, that single statement suddenly made the quietness make sense. Silence wasn't an accident. It was a sign of a very specific type of investigation. The kind where suspects are being observed, where statements are being compared, where investigators don't want anyone tipping anyone else off. And that realization made thousands of people pause and say, if this was just a wandering case, why so much silence? It was another major turning point, because silence, in this situation, became its own kind of evidence. And, as always, if you want to follow every update, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. Your engagement helps keep this case in the spotlight. Another point where this case completely stopped making sense was when more people began examining the timeline. The exact sequence of events from when Gus was last seen to when the first call for help was made. And once you lay the timeline out, something becomes clear. The numbers don't behave like a wandering child scenario, not even close. Here's what stood out. 1. The gap between when Gus was last seen and when he was reported missing felt unusually fast, or unusually slow. Depending on the version of the story retold by different people, the timing was slightly different. And in cases like this, minutes matter. Some accounts suggest he was last seen around a certain time. Then a short search happened, then police were called almost immediately, but other descriptions hint at a longer gap, a gap with no clear explanation. People began asking, was it really that quick? Or was there more time unaccounted for? And once a timeline has even small mismatches, investigators start digging deeper. 2. No trace found, despite the timing being extremely fresh. If Gus vanished in such a short window, the expectation is simple. There should have been something. A footprint, a disturbed patch of soil, a dropped toy, a direction of travel. But the land was clean. And that's when experts said, a child doesn't disappear this quickly and leave no trace unless the cause wasn't wandering. That realization was another moment where the case shifted in people's minds. 3. If the timeline is off, the entire story must be re-evaluated. In missing child cases, investigators rebuild timelines second by second. They ask, who was where? Who arrived when? Who left? Who made the call? What was happening inside the home? A single minute out of place can change everything. And here, people started noticing that certain details were missing entirely, as if parts of the story hadn't been spoken about publicly, or didn't align with what police now know. This gap in the narrative caused the public to stop and say, this case doesn't add up anymore, someone knows more. And again, if you want to stay updated or help keep this story alive, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. Your engagement genuinely keeps the search for truth going. Another moment when this case completely stopped making sense was when authorities made something very clear. There were no signs, none at all, that wildlife was involved. Now, in the Australian outback, that is highly unusual. Here's why this detail changed the entire direction of the investigation. 1. The area is known for predators, yet there were zero indicators. In similar cases, you'd expect investigators to at least consider wild dogs, dingoes, pigs, eagles, other scavenging animals, but police quickly ruled this out. There were no drag marks, no torn clothing, no disturbed soil, no blood, no scattered personal items, nothing. And for seasoned search teams, That was a major red flag. 2. Animals leave patterns, and none of those patterns were present. When investigators look for animal involvement, they look for tracks unusual disturbances, entry or exit paths, scuffle marks, broken vegetation, sign of chase or struggle. But the ground was described as undisturbed. It looked as if nothing had happened there at all. That's when people started realizing, if an animal didn't take him, what did? And that question changed everything. 3. No wildlife evidence means the disappearance was likely human-related. This is the uncomfortable conclusion investigators reach when all environmental possibilities are eliminated. And police didn't hesitate to say they found no evidence of foul play. But that doesn't mean foul play was ruled out. It simply means there was no physical trace pointing to any explanation. And when a child disappears without nature leaving a mark, the focus shifts to who was around, who had access, who had opportunity, who had a reason, who might be withholding information. This moment was another turning point where the story shifted from a child wandered off to something else might have happened. If you're following this case closely and want to help keep the pressure on, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. It genuinely helps push this story out to more people who